Hi, I'm Mark David Gerson. Welcome to Stories and Reflections, where my stories are also yours. For all that last week's episode was all about me kicking my knee-jerk habit of saying no to people and opportunities before I got around, finally, to surrendering and saying yes. Getting that episode filmed, that particular episode, was so stressful that I nearly said no to this podcast, or at least to the video version of it. No, well, that's not quite right. You can't really say no after you've already said yes. But what you can do is give up. And that's what I was seriously tempted to do, to give up on doing these podcasts as video. Now, it was easy, relatively speaking, to produce my first 8 audio-only episodes. I needed a better mic, and I manifested the miracle that got me one. And the acoustics where I'm staying were good enough, and the sound got even better once I found a way to master the audio files before uploading and publishing them. And I was familiar enough with Apple's GarageBand to get these episodes recorded and edited fairly easily. Video, however, has been a whole different story, and a much more challenging and frankly overwhelming one. I talked a few episodes back in my first video episode about my anxiety around putting a face to my stories, about telling my stories on camera. That was the emotional challenge, and it wasn't an easy one to deal with. Some episodes, in fact, have definitely pushed more buttons on that score than others. Video, however, has created a whole set of additional challenges, technical challenges and logistical challenges. Perhaps if I were living something resembling a normal life in my own home, condo, or apartment, in my own surroundings, in a situation I could better control, at least for filming purposes, I would have been able to avoid some of these technical and logistical challenges. Maybe not all, but certainly some. Since I left Toronto the first time in 1994, that time for Nova Scotia, I have had more than 25, I counted them, more than 25 permanent-ish, not quite permanent, but permanent-ish addresses in 2 Canadian provinces and 5 U.S. states. And I've lived in some of those states and some of those provinces multiple times. And I'm not including all those open-ended road odysseys I've been on over the years. 2 of those lasted more than 2 years, and through all of them, those 2 and the others, I rarely slept in the same place for more than 1 or 2 consecutive nights. I sort of came off the most recent of those journeys, my longest ever, nearly a year ago. And I'll come back in a minute to what I mean by sort of. So each of those journeys started for its own particular reason, and in the end, each of those journeys marked in some way the transition from one chapter of my life to another. The most recent of those journeys started, in January 2023, when I left Sedona. Now, there are all kinds of surface daily life reasons why I left Sedona. The most obvious was that the owner of my condo decided to return to Sedona to occupy it. And in a tourist town increasingly overrun with Airbnbs, not to mention an income stream that had never fully recovered from all the challenges of COVID, I didn't see any other option but to leave. But that's the surface reason, the inciting factor, if you will. The deeper reason, probably, was that it was time for me to embark on another adventure like this, time for another transition to another new chapter of my life. Well, to my surprise, the journey did not end after 3 months, which several other of my journeys did. It didn't even last for 30 months, my previous record. The funny thing is, I can't even say when exactly it did end, which is why I said sort of before. It just kind of eased into an ending, without me really being aware of it. Here's what happened. One day, that inner guidance, intuition, and inner wisdom that I've talked about on previous episodes had me book into an extended stay hotel in the Phoenix area for the weekend. Nearly 11 months later, and to my ongoing surprise and amazement, I'm still there, still here. I'm sure I'll talk about that journey more in a future episode, or maybe even in more than one, because it was a journey that exceeded 80,000 miles and had me back and forthing across 15 states from the Mississippi to the Pacific. And you know what? You collect lots of stories when you're on the road that long. For now, though, let's go back to the video podcast and its technical and logistical challenges. I bet you thought I'd strayed so far from that topic that I'd never find my way back. And you know what? Me too, if I'm honest. But like I said back in episode 10, our stories are smarter than we are. Those we live as much as those we write and those we tell, at least as long as we get out of their way. And this story, the one I'm telling you right now, apparently is no different. So one of the reasons I didn't consider doing video at the outset for these podcasts had to do with filming location. The layout and decor of my extended stay room are just not conducive for that sort of thing. And virtual backgrounds have their own challenges. I didn't really explore them back then, but once I decided to expand into video, I did. And what I discovered was that without a proper green screen backdrop, virtual backgrounds always look artificial, even kind of cheesy, certainly not professional. Still, even with a green screen, you need the right image for your virtual background. One that has the right scale, the right angle, and the right lighting to make it look realistic. I spent hours fruitlessly searching for workable photos until I finally discarded that option. Either the angle was wrong, or the lighting came from the wrong side, or the scale was all off. If I couldn't film in my room, where could I film? The function room in this hotel wasn't suitable, and I couldn't think of any other indoor location I could use, especially consistently every week. And that meant I would have to film outside. The good news there was the weather. Spring in the Phoenix area is nearly always sunny, with temperatures that are generally moderate. Now I say generally because it's over 100 degrees here today. But when I was exploring this 3 or 4 weeks ago, it was in the low to mid-80s. Still hot, but manageable in the shade, mostly first thing in the morning or late in the afternoon. So I planned to film my first video episode on a Saturday morning, and I headed out around 9:30 with a few location ideas, mostly city parks. What a bust! 3 parks, a nature preserve, a Starbucks patio, and 2 hours later, I was on my way back to my room, trying not to be discouraged. It was Saturday morning in the spring. The parks were overrun with little leaguers and their parents and families. So much so that at 2 of the parks, I couldn't even find parking. I decided to try again at the end of the afternoon and return to the nearest of the parks. Thankfully, by then all the ball players and their families had left, yay! And I found a reasonably quiet picnic table in the shade where I could set up my phone on my tripod. At that hour, the light was also softer, which is good because it can be pretty harsh here during the day. Still, I had to stop and start a bunch of times because of motorcycles, screaming kids, low-flying planes, and other noise, not to mention every time Kiri was triggered by a scooter, a skateboard, or another dog. So that was episode 9. And if you watch it, you'll see the park behind me, including some park activity and traffic also behind me. I mentioned a minute ago that I've been using my phone to film. There's a funny thing about that. Well, not so much funny as a confirmation of that intuition and inner guidance I keep talking about. I've had iPhones for lots of years, and in the past I've tended to upgrade them every 2 years, mostly because I'm also a photographer and I wanted the updated camera. But because I've been doing much less photography over the past couple of years, I skipped the second year. But back in October, this past fall, I felt strongly guided, it's that intuitive inner knowingness again, I felt strongly guided to upgrade my iPhone 14 Pro to a 17 Pro. I wasn't sure why if it wasn't for the camera, but Verizon offered me a super deal, so I did it. Then a few months later, when it came time to plan these podcasts, I realized why. With my new phone's front-facing camera, I can film in 4K, a huge video quality improvement over my old phone. See, my story does know best, and it was a reminder to me that when I follow that inner guidance, even when it doesn't seem to make sense, which is a lot of the time, things work out for the best. And for me, that's a reminder that never gets old. Back to locations. So episode 9 was filmed, edited, and published, and now it was time for episode 10. Would my shaded picnic table in the park still be available? Could I replicate the previous week's experience? Thankfully, it was, and I could, well, more or less. And if you watch it, you'll see the same background as in the previous week. Well, so far, so good. I was relieved, but just a bit wary, because I was aware that once we started to hit 3-digit temperatures that were up in the teens, even my shaded location wasn't going to work. Still, it was early March, and I had until June to deal with that, or at least mid to late May. Well, that's what I thought until this week. As everyone is experiencing everywhere, the weather just ain't what it used to be. The only thing it is these days with any consistency is unpredictable. And last week gave Phoenix its hottest March days on record. So let's cut to episode 11. This time I opted to film on a weekday morning. I figured I'd avoid the little leaguers, and with most people in school or at work, the park would be quiet. Well, I couldn't have been more wrong. Cyclists, dog walkers, tennis players, preschoolers, retirees, playground screamers, they were all out in force. And I couldn't even use my regular picnic table. At that time of day, it was in full sun. I wandered around the park for about 20 minutes and finally found a shaded picnic table. That was the good news. The bad news was that it was right next to the parking lot, and every time someone parked their car and locked their car and beeped their key fob, the beep interrupted my recording. After a few false starts, I gave up. When I returned late that afternoon, planning to go back to the picnic table I'd used before, because by then it would be in the shade, it hadn't moved into full sun. That was the bad news. The good news was that I eventually found another shaded table and began to record. But there was more bad news. The bad news was that I started too late. Daylight was fading, and I found myself talking more and more quickly to win the race against nightfall. Unfortunately, nightfall won, and I stopped about halfway through the recording. And that's when I said, no more. That's when I said, I give up. And I meant it, at least as far as video was concerned. However strongly I'd been guided to do this, and I'd been hugely, powerfully strongly guided to do the video, it just wasn't working. And I didn't see any way to fix it, not without some sort of miracle. Well, I got my miracle almost immediately. 2 miracles, in fact. A few days earlier, a Sedona friend who has a huge stash of filming equipment had offered to ship me some lights and a backdrop that might make it possible to film in the room. So after my afternoon into night filming fiasco, I texted her to remind her. Because as I saw it, that was my only hope, because I wasn't in any position to buy the equipment myself. Then, as I was getting ready for bed a few hours later, I thought maybe I'd come up with a way that I could film in the room, at least for that week. It would involve weird angles, an uncomfortable sitting position, and very, very makeshift lighting. But maybe it would work. I tried it out next morning, and it did, sort of. That was the first miracle. The second miracle came in a text from my Sedona friend responding to my reminder to ship me her surplus filming equipment. What she said was, I want to help you get what you really need, not some hand-me-downs. Make a list, she said. If you can contribute, that'd be great. If not, don't worry about it. I'll take care of it. It took several hours of AI research, but I came up with my list. All the gear hasn't arrived yet, but it should be here in time for next week's episode, which is why I'm still back in the room here. Now, step number 9 in my book, The Way of the Fool, says, don't give up. I should probably reread that section regularly, given all the times I've been tempted to give up, including for this podcast. And the book itself, The Way of the Fool, grew out of another moment when I was tempted to give up. And to be honest, it was more than a temptation, and it was about something much bigger than a podcast. It was about my entire creative and spiritual journey, which for about 3 weeks back then felt beyond futile. Then there was a time I gave up on writing, and that lasted about 2 weeks. Those are both powerful, really powerful stories, and I'm sure I'll get to them in another episode. But if you can't wait until the first in The Way of the Fool, and I chronicle the second and some others in my Acts of Surrender memoir. Now, one of the things I say about not giving up in The Way of the Fool book is, it's never too late to rekindle the hope that is shriveled into hopelessness. And it's never too early to give up on the idea of giving up. Again, something I probably need to reread on a fairly regular basis because I do get overwhelmed easily, and it's easy for me to want to back off and give up. I don't give up a lot, but I'm tempted a lot. So like I said last week about fear, it's not about stuffing our feelings away and refusing to feel them. It's not about refusing to feel the feelings that make us want to give up. That's profoundly unhealthy, and ultimately it will only make things worse, physically sometimes as well as emotionally. What it is about feeling those feelings and moving through them to the other side of them. And sometimes, although it isn't always necessary, understanding where those feelings came from is part of that journey through the feelings to the other side. And if you have the Way of the Fool, step number 9 offers some exercises to help you do just that. Now, for me, the temptation to give up is generally tied to some kind of crisis of faith, to a feeling that following my intuition, my inner guidance, my inner knowingness, whatever you want to call it, has somehow made things worse, has even led to a perceived disaster of some sort. A few minutes ago, when I was talking about the inner guidance that got me my new phone with its 4K video capabilities, the one I'm recording on right now, I said that it was a reminder to me that when I follow my inner guidance, things work out for the best. Even when that inner guidance doesn't seem to make sense. Even when it triggers the frustration, the anger, and sometimes the tears that make me want to give up. That sometimes do cause me to give up, at least in the moment. Well, giving up on a video podcast would hardly have been a life-changing decision. Or maybe it would have been. How can I know in the moment all the implications, all the consequences of not following the whispers of the small, still voice of my intuitive mind? How can I ever know what missed gifts, what missed connections, and what missed opportunities lie along the road not taken? I talk a lot in my writing courses and workshops about icebergs. Icebergs? Why icebergs? Well, as I understand it, only 8% of an iceberg is visible above the waterline. The remaining 92%, in other words, nearly all of it, is invisible. What we see with our conscious mind, with our conscious imagination even, whether it's the story we're writing or the story we're living, is that limited 8%. The remaining 92% lies beneath the waterline of our conscious mind's ability to not only see, but to imagine. That 92% is where our intuition lives. It's where our inner guidance lives. It's where the voice of our heart speaks from. If we're writers or other kinds of creative artists, it's where the voice of the muse, of our muse, speaks from. It's where our inner wisdom resides. It's where infinite mind lives and counsels us from. And more often than not, it transcends anything our logical minds can figure out or explain. In other words, it often appears to make no sense. But in the end, if we trust it, if we follow it, in the end, it makes more sense than anything else. By the way, all 4 of my Way of the Fool books include powerful tools and exercises to help you foster your intuition and connect you with that 92%. Now, that 92% is also where our miracles germinate, the little miracles as well as the big ones. So it's also where the miracles germinated, that's making it possible for me to continue these video podcasts without all the stress of those first couple of episodes. I wish I could say that I will never again be tempted to give up, that I've learned the lesson of the Way of the Fool's step number 9. But you know what? Life's journey is just too full of potholes, detours, and dead ends, or at least seeming apparent dead ends, for that to be a realistic commitment. What I can say, what I can know, is that even in the midst of all my frustrations and crises of faith, even through all those times when I have wanted to give up, or for a few moments or a few weeks, I have given up, those whispers, that intuitive knowingness, that small, still voice of infinite wisdom has never, ever steered me wrong and never let me down. Why would it start now? Thanks for joining me for Stories and Reflections today. I hope you found moments in my stories that touched something in yours. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And for more of my stories and help telling yours, check out my books at markdavidgerson.com or from online booksellers worldwide. Until next time, don't forget that you're a storyteller too, and keep telling your stories. The intro and outro music for today's episode is Heartwarming by Kevin MacLeod from Incompetech.com, licensed under Creative Commons.